Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dorinda Reyna, your moderator for today's webinar. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter via the chat feature or Q&A feature. You may send your questions in at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's speakers include Dan Cornell, a globally recognized application security expert who holds over 15 years of experience architecting, developing, and securing web-based software systems. As Chief Technology Officer and Principal at Denham Group, he leads the technology team to help Fortune 500 companies and government organizations integrate security throughout the development process. Also speaking today, Arpit Joshipura, bringing more than 25 years of industry experience in enterprise IT and the security ecosystem to Prevoty. Arpit has been instrumental in moving closed and proprietary IT infrastructures to an open, secure, and software-defined world. He has served in executive leadership positions in startups and enterprises throughout Silicon Valley. Dan?
Thanks, Dorinda. I want to thank you all for coming out today. We're excited about the work we've been doing with ThreadFix, excited about the stuff that the folks at Prevoty are doing, and are I guess doubly excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all about some of the things that we're doing together. From an agenda standpoint, we're going to talk a little bit about the state of application security just to set the stage. Then I'll provide an overview of ThreadFix for folks who may not be familiar with it. Then Arpit will be talking about Rasp and specifically about what Prevoty is doing in this space. Then we'll talk a little bit about how we're integrating Prevoty's Rasp with ThreadFix. As Dorinda said, we'll be collecting questions along the way. I'm happy to answer your questions when we get to the end. Now I'll turn things over to Arpit to talk a little bit about the state of application security.
Thanks, Dan, and a warm welcome to everybody. And this is Arpit, as was mentioned earlier. What I want to do is give you an overview of where things are in the world of runtime application security. There are many acronyms, and as we all know, security has been a fragmented market. But the good thing coming out of this year's Gartner conference, which is listed on the top, is the number 4 predictions, which is almost 40% of enterprises by 2020 will be adopting some form of self-test, self-diagnostic, self-protection technologies, things like Rasp, which stands for Runtime Application Self-Protection. Yes, it is a Gartner term, but in a broader sense, what it does is it provides security to applications from within the application in production at runtime versus some of the testing technologies are used more in the development cycle and in the staging cycle. So that's kind of the fundamental distinction. The reason this is important is that the attacks are on the rise, and from the Verizon report that was published earlier this quarter, web application attacks were the #1 vector for breaching. And that's kind of important to note that the vulnerabilities found in the development cycle and the hackers exploiting this vulnerability in production are two different things. There may be vulnerability in a specific category of threats, but some of the more frequent ones, whether it's OWASP Top 10 or SANS 25, they get exposed and exploited for the breaches. So this is more on the breaching side. The second point that I want to highlight is, we did a survey of enterprises, this year, and the vulnerability backlog is significantly on the rise. Almost 90% of the enterprises have up to 5,000 vulnerabilities, and they cannot be fixed because it's time, money, and effort. And we'll talk about some of the newer techniques that are used to, mitigate this. From a runtime perspective, now I think customers, analysts, and everybody that we talk to are looking at these newer technologies because A, vulnerabilities cannot be resolved, and B, production attacks have to be stopped at runtime. So the good news is we have seen a lot of announcements from a lot of vendors, Prevoty being the first leader, and then a lot of other vendors who have come out with a plan. So this is the state of runtime application security, and I'll hand it over back to Dan.
Thanks, Arpit. Wanted to provide a little bit of background about ThreadFix for folks who may not be familiar. And ThreadFix is a vulnerability resolution platform that lets organizations do a couple of critical things for their application security program. The first thing it lets you do is to create a consolidated view of all the applications in your portfolio and all the vulnerabilities you've identified through different types of testing, be that static, dynamic, interactive, or all the manual activities that go into a program as well. Next, ThreadFix lets you prioritize the risk decisions that you're making about your applications based on this data. Finally, ThreadFix lets you translate these vulnerabilities over to developers in the tools that they're already using in order to reduce friction from the remediation process. In even moderately sophisticated application security programs, you'll find that they are multi-technology, multi-activity. So there's a lot of different things going on. Static testing, dynamic testing, interactive testing, manual testing, third-party reviews, all of these activities that go into identifying vulnerabilities in applications. And what we find is this data needs to be communicated to a number of different stakeholders. You need to be able to report on this, you need to be able to communicate it to developers, and you need to be able to communicate risk up in the organization. And so what we do with ThreadFix, we want to save your security team time in managing all of this data analysis and this data communication. We want to save them time so that they can focus on the really high-value activities. That's a challenge that we see across the application security industry. And Arpit alluded to this before with organizations having 5,000 plus vulnerabilities. If you look at the number of developers in your organization versus the number of security professionals, the application security team is outnumbered. So they need every chance they have or every weapon that they can possibly get a hold of in order to deal with the scale problems that they face. And so with ThreadFix, we want to save these folks time. We've got a strong focus on automation. How can we take advantage of automation that's already in place, and how can we drive new opportunities for automation, with the goal being to provide as efficient an application security program as possible. So when we look at creating a consolidated view of your applications and your vulnerabilities, in your organization, you probably have multiple teams that are developing software. You have multiple applications that are being developed. And ThreadFix lets you keep track of this portfolio of applications across all the development teams spanning across the organization. It also lets you capture critical metadata about the systems that these folks are building. What sort of compliance requirements the different applications have, what languages and platforms are in use, how are they hosted, how are they presented to users. And this allows you to start the beginning of your prioritization strategy. It provides you visibility across your portfolio so you can see where the critical applications are. Next, ThreadFix lets you do vulnerability consolidation. As I had mentioned before, most programs are using a variety of scanners. They have a variety of technologies: static application security testing, dynamic application security testing, interactive application security testing. You're also doing manual reviews, maybe you have third parties, and these are all data feeds that are producing data about the security state of your application portfolio. ThreadFix lets you load all of that into one central location so that you can start to make sense of this data. What we saw in a number of organizations, they would run a scanner, some sort of a dynamic scanner, generate a 300-page PDF, hand it to the development team, and wonder why the developers grumbled and didn't actually fix anything. Then they'd run a different scanner, come up with a different super long PDF, hand it to the development team, and the developers would go up through their management and say, the security team is actively wasting my time. Keep these folks away from me. And the mandate would come down. You have to provide a central view, you have to provide one view of this data if you want the developers to take action. So then you have your application security folks making giant Excel spreadsheets and trying to line things up, which is a horrible use of their time. So with ThreadFix, we have an engine that lets you load in the results of all this testing. ThreadFix normalizes that data and provides you with that single view. We also include the hybrid analysis mapping technology that we've developed in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. This allows you to coordinate and consolidate the results of static application security testing as well as dynamic application security testing. The goal of all this is to provide efficiencies. You load in these data feeds, and ThreadFix provides you with a single heads-up display of a consolidated list of the vulnerabilities that have been identified. From there, you can start to make decisions. Because you have all this data in a structured format, you can use this data to start to make risk decisions about what applications and which vulnerabilities are going to get fixed and how. You know, there's a saying that if everything is important, then nothing is important, and that's a critical mantra I think people need to have when they look at how they're building their application security program. You have to be able to look across your application portfolio and look at the criticality of the applications and their characteristics. And you also have to be able to look at specific applications and the vulnerabilities that have been identified. You're not going to have the time to fix everything, so you need to make decisions about what's going to get fixed, what are we going to address, and how. And we'll talk more about this later, but a very interesting capability or a very valuable capability of Prevoty and Rasp as a technology is that gives you options in the way that you address vulnerabilities. The traditional way that vulnerabilities have to be fixed in the application security world, you have to go in and make code-level changes for each vulnerability. You know, that's all well and good if you can get the developer's attention to do that, but developers have a finite appetite, and their managers have a finite appetite for fixing vulnerabilities. And so with Rasp, that gives you additional options on how you choose to address the risk associated with vulnerabilities. What we want to do with ThreadFix is provide visibility so that you can make those decisions the right way for your organization. ThreadFix also gives you the ability to do reporting and to look at metrics across your program. So you can take a quantitative view of how you're running your application security program. Instead of relying on fear, uncertainty, and doubt to try and convince management to allocate budget or to make decisions, you can go then with data to benchmark what you are doing in your organization versus publicly available data sets. This lets you make decisions, it lets you try experiments, it lets you see the impact of those so that you can optimize the limited resources you have and put them in the most valuable direction. So this is driving both visibility across the program as well as driving efficiencies because you can focus on what matters. Finally, ThreadFix lets you translate vulnerabilities to developers and the tools that they're already using. And whether or not this is done with ThreadFix, that is probably the key critical differentiator that we've seen between application security programs that start to make progress and the ones that really struggle. As we talked before, developers don't speak PDF. Trying to communicate with developers about security with 300-page PDFs with sticky notes pasted on them is a horrible idea. By the way, it's also a horrible idea just to email the PDFs to them. Similarly, if the responsibility gets pushed back to security to put everything in Excel spreadsheets for a consolidated view, well, developers also don't speak Excel. What you need to do is you need to take this vulnerability data that security people care about and turn that into backlog or security work that the development teams care about. And the developers are managing their workloads in defect tracking systems. So with ThreadFix, you can bundle up this vulnerability data in the way that's going to be most consumable by the developers and make it live in the systems the developers are already using. So instead of security being something special that they have to work off of a separate system or that they have to keep a separate to-do list, instead the security work lives alongside all of the other work that they need to do. New features, non-security related bugs, performance issues, all the other things that the developer has to do as part of their job. This allows you to make security a normal part of developers' activities. And again, as I've said, that's the biggest differentiator that we've seen to get developers to start to fix the vulnerabilities that they've introduced as a normal course of doing business. Some of the most exciting use cases we've seen for ThreadFix are around security teams working with development teams to get security injected into their continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines. We're seeing some really exciting stuff that folks are doing with that, and we've got some case studies that you can link to from the PDF. Obviously, the slides and the recording will be available. But it's a question to ask, what does your development pipeline look like, and how have you integrated security into that development pipeline? We talked before about the need for efficiency and how security teams are outnumbered. If you can start to push out certain testing tasks out to the edges, out to the development teams, that's a great way to get leverage, where they start to automatically feed you the data you need about the security state of what they're doing so that you can act as a consultant and to help them resolve vulnerabilities as they come up. So that's some background on ThreadFix. At this point, I would like to turn things over to Arpit to talk about runtime application self-protection, as well as what they're doing with Prevoty.
Awesome, thank you. So, what we covered so far is, the traditional SDLC process where, you assume that the developers and the security professionals will be working closely together to make sure that most of the vulnerabilities are identified, logged, fixed, corrected, prioritized, the whole 100 yards, right? But here's the reality. Businesses run at a pace which is far more than the developer's time. And so things will ship into production. And now what happens in production is what, I'm going to talk about, which is really where Rasp plays in. And so if you look at the survey I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the presentation, here is an infographics around the survey. Now, the good news is I've kept it really small so that you can go to Prevoty.com and download this survey if you need the exact specifics. But let me point out a few big things that have come out. The intent of the survey was, in production, what really happens? And we looked at, the IT groups, because they are responsible for the infrastructure and for running the application in production and sort of the firewalls and things like that. And we looked at the security professionals or the CISO organizations that have, responsibility or results for showing that the enterprise is rock solid. And we found very interestingly that there is a massive gap between the two organizations, and that's one of the causes of the breaches and the hacks that we have seen increase in the recent times. So on the right-hand side, you see there's a couple of findings that I want to highlight. We've already touched on the first one, which is over 90% have up to 5,000 vulnerabilities in backlog. These are not fixed, and you can mitigate them, and you can basically have bypass your standard SDLC or make it part of SDLC process to go into production with vulnerabilities using tools like Prevoty or Rasp. The second interesting thing that I want to highlight from a data perspective is, in production, there are traditional solutions available. There are firewalls, WAFs, other mechanisms that do have a role to play. But what we heard back from security professionals is that they spend almost 3.5 days a week to tune their solutions. That means downloading signatures, patterns, cases, new firmware upgrades, et cetera, just to keep up with the innovation that's happening in the hackers world. So clearly you can see that on one side there is a backlog of vulnerabilities. On the operations side there is a massive crunch of time that security professionals don't have, and they got to come up with something that is more interesting and more easy to use. So if we go down and look at what really happens in production, right? You will find that yes, there are OWASP top 10, but most of the hackers exploit the following three: SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and CSRF, as shown on the right-hand side. Everybody knows that applications are more vulnerable, and security is a priority, but the top three vectors essentially constitute 95% of the attacks in production. So what do you do? From our perspective, as we work with a lot of customers, especially in the enterprise space, the financials, the banking, insurance, e-commerce, web, healthcare, etc., it is kind of clear that the CISOs are, making security and runtime security priority, but they're going to go do it in 3 easy steps. So let me just walk you through some of these steps very, very quickly. The first step is knowing where you are. So if as an organization you do not know the maturity of your AppSec program, that's your first thing, right? Even RSA came out with a 5-point or a 5-scale technique of identifying the status of your application security. What we provide here is we say, hey, let's look at some of your parameters and kind of align you to an early stage, an intermediate, or a mature stage. What that means is if you're in an early stage of maturity, you have mostly ad hoc approach for pen testing, remediation, mostly a checkbox on compliance, very limited tools. Versus if you are on the intermediate side, yes, you have testing going on, but the remediation and the protection is not there. There's a massive backlog, as we have seen from the survey, and some of the tools are in place, the framework's in place, you're using some of the WAFs, but generally you put it in a passive mode because you're worried that your application may slow down or there might be false positives or things like that, right? And if you're really a mature AppSec program, which surprisingly not a lot of Fortune 2000 companies are, you are doing continuous testing, you are doing remediation, you are doing monitoring, you have a lot of tools operationalized, and you do implement the runtime monitoring. So most of the enterprises strive from going from early stage to a maturity stage. And what happens is as they look at the plethora of tools that are provided, it is important to get an understanding of where you are, because the use cases that you get for runtime are different for each of these scenarios. So that's your step one, right? Identify where your AppSec program is in terms of maturity. The second step is really look at your overall end-to-end architecture. Now we've seen, I've personally, been talking to several customers where we've seen several weird architecture configurations. But what I've intended to do here in this slide is to show you a very classic, traditional, end-to-end architecture where you have on the left users coming in through a web browser or a mobile app into a load balancer, sort of the network-based firewalls, WAFs, API gateways, etc. What I call classic bump in the wire. They are handed off to either a web API or a backend application running, the app itself. And then on the right-hand side, you're hitting either a database or a SIM or, things like that. A very, very standard classic architecture. What the recommendation is, if you understand what your architecture is, you can actually do a layered defense approach, a defense and depth approach as we call it, and put runtime security inside the application, inside the backend application behind the firewalls. And what it'll do is it'll protect the application itself with the connectivity tissues between the operating system itself or the SQL database or the web browser rendering as we can see it. So that's kind of, your second step, which is the modern security architecture. The third is, what longer term tools do you use? And we have started seeing Gartner come out with some recommendation here as I started the webinar with, where you have continuous process, you have the SDLC process, and as the two handoff, monitoring and analytics, and as Dan said, a single view of all the threats and the vulnerabilities that can be handed off. Then on the right-hand side, in production, you can use Rasp as a tool, to predict, prevent, detect, remediate, change. There's basically, just two simple mechanisms. You do testing in the development cycle, and then you put Rasp in production. And what that does is, it gives you a full layered approach, and it allows you to sort of look at end-to-end application security without worrying about a lot of, bump in the wires or point products. Okay. Now, having said that, I want to give you a couple of slides on, Prevoty and, how Rasps are architected. So the first thing I would say is, there are many variety of Rasps available in the market, and they are not all equal. What we have done here is used a technique called LangSec. It's come out of the academia, several years ago, and we have productized it. It stands for Language Theoretic Security, and that technology essentially requires no signatures, no expressions, no regex, blacklist, whitelist, pattern matching, heuristics, data flow, all of the traditional methods that are used for traditional security products, right? Whether it's IDS, IPS, firewalls, VAPs, or other companies' Rasp products, right? So we typically don't have to rely on this traditional methodology, and what that gives you is it gives you accuracy, simplicity, and speed. Okay, and we have seen speeds almost 50 times better, which basically means that in production, you're not slowing down the app, and that's why you would see the Rasp market move really fast. Now, just for those of you who are not familiar with LangSec and who are Googling the word right now, I would just go www.prevoty.com/LangSec. We have lots of university white papers and a lot of details, technical details on LangSec available for your information. The good news is, it is a proven technology with lots of production deployments, and at the highest level, it basically removes obfuscation and fuzzing from the data input. And basically what happens is, it protects very, very accurately at the code execution level, right? So for example, for those of you who are very technical on the call, if you have a tautology or if you have a statement of truth that says 1 = 1, it would bypass the regular expressions and go straight into the app, and if it returns 2, it'll dump out all the credit card information and passwords and admins and things like that. That's what we block, okay? So very, very interesting technology. I won't go too much into the solutions. I'm sure you get bored from vendor pitches, but here's the thing. We have both monitoring and protection software, no changes required to the application, and it's from within the app itself. Now, what you get from the monitoring part of it is that you get legacy and new applications as well as third-party applications protected. And what you get insights from is the who, what, where, and when of the attacks, because we are inside the application. So the threat, the origin of the threat, the nature of the threat, what they exploited, where did that take place, right? None of this information is available, from a standard WAF or any firewalls, because they're not inside the applications, and we are. Okay, and then of course, as we talked about, you need a central tool like a Splunk or any of the SIMs that you can visualize the data with, et cetera, and we provide that as well. Okay, so that's a very simple, high-level view on what runtime security is, what Prevoty does specifically around Rasp, and and the fact that not all Rasps are equal. And then I'll hand it over back to Dan for talking about how you guys can utilize the power of integration between ThreadFix and Prevoty.
Thanks, Arpit. So yeah, just wanted to talk a little bit about the value of integrating these technologies, both Rasp and Prevoty, with your vulnerability resolution platform, and talk a little bit about the mechanics of the integration. What you'll be able to do is, when managing applications in ThreadFix, you have the ability to set up a number of the characteristics of the application. You can flag it with metadata, And now you can also mark an application as being protected by Prevoty and Rasp in production. This lets us start to make certain decisions or to make certain information available to you. So if you'll recall before, when we looked at the process of looking through vulnerabilities that had been identified by your SAS testing, DAS testing, IAS testing, whatever it might be, that basically gives you a list of vulnerabilities that exist in the application. And so ThreadFix, when it displays those vulnerabilities for an application that is being protected by Prevoty, takes into account the vulnerability types that Prevoty will block attacks against. And Arpit talked a little bit about some of those earlier. So that you can flag those vulnerabilities, and then you can factor this information into the decisions that you make about remediation. For a given vulnerability, do you want to ask the developers to make a code change? Do you want to rely on Prevoty protection in order to, in order to guard against attempted exploits against that vulnerability? Do you want to live with the risk? Again, this gives you visibility so that you can start to make risk-based decisions. This is another set of information that you can factor into the prioritization and remediation decisions that you're making. In addition, by understanding which applications are and are not protected by Prevoty across your application portfolio, and using the knowledge you have from your testing program about the exposure levels of different applications, that lets you start to make prioritization decisions. Based on the vulnerability data, based on the protections that Prevoty can provide, you can determine which applications do I want to go first as I look to deploy this technology. And what you want to understand is where can Prevoty and Rasp have the greatest impact on my program and where can it reduce the most risk. So this provides you additional visibility so that you can use your understanding of your application portfolio, your understanding of the risk associated with the vulnerabilities that you have, and you can use this to shape future decisions about what technologies you want to deploy, when you want to prioritize that deployment, and what benefit you expect to get from that. So that all feeds into the idea of getting visibility across your program and efficiency. How do I make the best use of the available resources that I have? So just to summarize what we've been talking about, using Prevoty and Rasp, they give you unparalleled insights from within the running application. By understanding what protections you have available, you can more efficiently prioritize and remediate, provide protection from certain classes of vulnerabilities. And by having this visibility across your portfolio to understand the risk associated with the vulnerabilities you've identified, that can help you to optimize your deployment of Prevoty Rasp, making decisions about the risk associated with the vulnerabilities that you have from the exposure and the value you will get by providing those protections. Now we'll open things up for questions. Here's some information about, again, contact information. And we'll open this up real quick. This is a question for Arpit. What are the main use cases for deploying Rasp?
Sure. What we have seen is the #1 use case is really for the customers or enterprises with the intermediate AppSec maturity program. And that is what we have talked about in the webinar. And that's, there's a backlog of vulnerability and there's no way to fix it. And so you got to mitigate it in production with Prevoty. We call it bridge the gap use case, and that's kind of the #1. The other use case we have seen is the layered defense use case. So typically defense in depth is a good architectural strategy, and people go in and put several layers, segregate them, and then apply the appropriate techniques of security to do that. So that along with another use case that has come up recently is exception control that a CISO kind of needs to get apps into production. I mean, we have a whole list of use cases on our website also, but I would say these are the top 3.
Excellent. Next up with the questions, how can the hybrid analysis mapping capability of ThreadFix help me protect my vulnerable applications via the Prevoty Rasp solution? Also an excellent question. So you're really working on 2 sides of the coin there. What the hybrid analysis mapping in ThreadFix lets you do is it lets you load in the results of different type of testing, specifically SAST and DAST, but also including IAST, so static, dynamic, and interactive. And the HAM technology provides you with a consolidated list of those vulnerabilities in an automagic way. So you get that list of exposed vulnerabilities. On the other side of the coin, the Prevoty Rasp is going to provide its protections against certain classes of vulnerabilities. And so the value of combining these is if you know the vulnerabilities that you have in an application by having consolidated all these different data feeds across SAST, DAST, and IAST, by having a consolidated view in the data and matching that up with the vulnerability classes that you're getting protection from the Rasp, again, you can either make determinations to say, I'm going to rely on Rasp to protect these things, that lets me focus in these other areas. And also if you take a step back and look across the portfolio, you can say, I know I have a lot of vulnerabilities based on these different data feeds. I have a lot of vulnerabilities in this application that's a very high-value application. And a number of those vulnerabilities can be protected by Prevoty Rasp. Therefore, I'm going to prioritize this application for rollout first because that's going to reduce the exposure window that we have associated with. And so that's kind of how, on the one side, the vulnerability management meets up with the Rasp protection. The next question is, Arpit, you talked about this a little bit, but maybe you want to talk a little bit more. What is the typical performance of a Rasp?
Sure. I think I hinted on that, right? Typically what happens is all security products these days, right, they use traditional expressions or regular expressions, right? So you basically have something to do pattern matching on, and then you download signatures or you use some version of data flow analysis, heuristics, etc., to determine whether, this is good or bad. All of those techniques use CPU time, they burn memory, even the fastest of the fastest servers and VMs or containers, right, they can only do so much in production. So what we have seen is with LangSec, because none of these exist, we have seen almost, 50x improvement, which means, the application performance is not at all noticeable, when it goes through a Prevoty like Rasp. I think there's a video on this at OWASP LA show that we have recorded on our website that actually shows the demo of this in terms of side-by-side comparison, but feel free to message us if you need the specifics of performance, but it's really, really fast.
Excellent. Next up, what languages does hybrid analysis mapping support? Right now, we've got support for the Java language, specifically for JSP, struts, and Spring frameworks. We support C# for ASP.NET Web Forms and ASP.NET MVC. We support Ruby, Ruby for Ruby on Rails, and support kind of basic support for PHP applications. So those are the currently supported languages and frameworks, and we're obviously working with customers to identify their priorities to identify which additional languages and platforms we want to support. The next question is Rasp replacing host-based WAF? How do you differentiate, for example, heuristics-based or signature-based, versus a host-based WAF? And also, Arpit, if you could maybe talk about the different management requirements for a host-based WAF versus a Rasp.
Sure. So I think if I abstract it out, right, we have seen customers do a couple of things, right? Either they have a WAF or they don't, right? And then that's kind of where the first step is. If they do, then they could have it in a passive mode or an active mode, right? And for each of these scenarios, depending on the value they're getting out of the Rasp, a different use case and an architecture emerges. What we recommend typically is because, and again, the WAF also has a third attribute, which is, are they implemented in a CDN, a cloud, or is it implemented, on-prem locally, right? So those three factors, whether they have, that's how you go around, determining what's the right strategy. What we have seen is, WAF is good at DDoS type, application DDoS type attacks, right? So there's lots of network layer, higher layer attacks that, still will be protected. And then if you need, and so, if you are on a CDN, there's a WAF in the cloud, cloud-based WAF, go ahead and use that. But rest assured that there will be attacks and hackers will pass that and hit your application, and that's where you put the Rasp in, right? So depending on the environment and your starting point, there's a little bit, couple of different answers that I would probably suggest, and we can take that offline if you need any more information.
Excellent. Another question for Arpit. Is it true that Rasp can be more precisely built in using an API during new development versus existing apps without source code where Rasp is dependent on frameworks like Ruby on Rails?
It depends on the, implementation of Rasp. What we support, which I would say is kind of the easiest mechanism, is, we have SDKs, we have APIs, we have cloud-based versions. So there's no instrumentation needed. All the customers have to do is, let's say Java or any of the newer languages, right? These frameworks, you just integrate with it, and you're just ready to go when you put it in production, right? There is no source code changes required.
Perfect. Next question.
And I would also add, Dan, let me add one more thing. There are also options available where you can actually have a self-contained version of the solution, right? Where you can have not just the detection engine and the LangSec engine, but also the application all, along with the language-specific changes, all packaged into sort of a .NET or a Java type load, and ready to go.
Excellent. Next question for ThreadFix. What's the current list of static analysis tools supported and what's upcoming? We support most of the major commercial and open source static analysis tools, the Fortify checkmarks, Baracode, White Hat's Sentinel Source. I'm going to forget somebody, and somebody's going to be mad at me. So my apologies if I didn't rattle that off, Brakeman and whatnot. What I'll do with the show notes is I'll post a list of the supported technologies. I think we're also, on the horizon, I think we're also looking to work with the Coverity folks. So again, most of the major tools, and in addition, we've got an API where you can add support for additional tools if you have custom tools that you've developed in your organization. I'll post a list to the APIs for the extension APIs as well. Next question. If applicable, how do you promote developer-initiated analysis, IDE-based static analysis before the centralization? Great question, and that's something I talked about where there's a lot of value in, to the degree that the security team can influence development teams to take over certain testing activities, that has the opportunity to be a great win for the security team because it gives them scale. They can help to set up and tune scans in an environment once and then take advantage of that tuning. They only have to go back and manage exceptions or changes to the build process. And so, a lot of the static analysis providers, they have IDE-based, they have plugins for IDEs that can let you initiate scans. Where we see, from a ThreadFix standpoint, we typically see more of the data once it has been centralized. So again, you have the ability to influence developers. Say, hey, here's a tool, here's how to use it. If you can get them trained up on how to use it, again, a lot of the static analysis engines have very nice IDE plugins that allow for that type of analysis. We work more with folks on the again, on the centralized side, but also helping folks instrument their CI/CD pipeline so the developers don't necessarily have to, the developers don't necessarily have to run the static analysis engine. Instead, this is something where you work with the build team to get the application scan set up, configured, and kind of tuned so that you've pulled out false positives and things like that. And so that gets run inside the CI/CD pipeline. Where we're going with this in ThreadFix is even more support where you can start to set policies to say, I want to run this type of testing and I want to wait for it to finish and I want to fail if anybody introduces any new high or critical vulnerabilities. That's an area where we're doing a lot of work working with customers and helping to make it easier to put those types of decisions into the dev process. So again, hopefully that reasonably answers your question. Any other questions out there? My final question is, when is this available? Excellent question. Always a good one. So obviously, Prevoty is available right now, and you can go to www.prevoty.com and talk to those folks about what they're doing. ThreadFix is available as well. The Prevoty ThreadFix integration is slated for the 2.5 release of ThreadFix, which should be later this year. And if you're interested in looking at or being an early tester of these technologies, just shoot us a contact on the www.threadfix.it website. Just shoot us a contact form and say you're interested in doing that. We would love to talk to you and work with you. All right. Well, I think we've covered a lot here today. Appreciate everybody attending. Appreciate everybody and their questions. We'll be getting the slides posted here before too much longer, and we'll be making the video available if other people on y'all's end are interested in this as well. Again, just want to say thank you. Arpit, I don't know if you have any final things you want to say?
No, thank you very much. Thank you for staying through the webinar. I know, we can always parallel process, but good questions, and, let the application security take over the world.
Well, thank you all very much. Appreciate everybody coming out, and look forward to talking in the future. Thanks.